This is Duke University.
We live in a world where economics is based on the theory of rational actors acting in rational self-interest. Who are those people, I ask myself. And so you are the person who has reintroduced irrationality as an element of decision-making, as an element of economics. You are but then, in addition to that intuition, you're always devising just ingenious experiments to demonstrate things that everyone kind of knew, but you now find a new way to demonstrate them to us. You are the person who has demonstrated that many people are willing to be a little dishonest, but not that many people are willing to be really dishonest. Well, I knew that already. The IRS, I'm sure, has had you as a consultant. You are the person who discovers people are willing to pay radically more for their dinner if they're in a restaurant where something on the menu is even more expensive than the thing they ordered. So an $89 entree can be perfectly reasonable in one part of your life, whereas you really wouldn't pay $3.50 some other portion of the same day. And you just work as just this cornucopia of perceptions about humanity ingeniously demonstrated. And then there's another thing about you, which is you are very generous with your intelligence. At Duke, you have all kinds of people who are part of Team Ariely, graduate students, professional students, undergraduates who you welcome into your research projects. You do it, you make everybody be able to be a part of it. And I love the fact that although you teach in lots of different places, you also teach what I think is the largest undergraduate class, or the second, one of the top two at Duke, in the things I've just been describing. And the nature of the homework is to have people read the literature of social science and find some discovery that has been made, and then figure out how would you write that into a memo to a CEO about what would you do differently in your business if you grasp something about the nature of the psychological facts that interest you. I could go on and on. Maybe I already did. In any case, let me now welcome Dan Ariely on stage.
You didn't mention that I'm a cheap date, and this is my second glass.
I didn't mention because I didn't know it. How are you?
I'm good.
Yeah, this is good. Okay, so where to start with you?
Actually, I have to start by saying I was supposed to teach today. But
maybe
thankfully, my wife is teaching for me, so I think...
His wife also teaches at Duke. She teaches in the Global Health Program. So you went to school, you studied all these disciplines that study human behavior, but not on the premise of irrationality. And as you trained in them, instead of having that nonsense beaten out of you, you were sort of bitten by the bug of wanting to make that, reintroduce the irrational into the accounts of economic psychology and other things. I especially would ask you this question, which is, what possessed you to get a PhD in cognitive psychology and then another one in business administration? On the face of it, is preposterous.
So first, I had a good time in school. I actually enjoyed. I mean, this is why I stayed.
So it would seem.
But I always had an interest in applying academic stuff to the world outside of academia. And when I started studying psychology, I had this idea that that's what we were going to do, and I figured out that this was not going to happen so well in that discipline, and I thought the business school might be a better way to do it. So as you know, and some of you might know, I became interested in irrationality by being in hospital for a long time. And if you observe life through the principle of having things done to you against your will in many ways, and ask yourself the question of whether this is the right thing to do or not, in many cases I said this was not the right thing. And then I became very interested in saying, how do we limit the misery in the world when people do things out of a sense of tremendous conviction and think they're doing the right thing? Is this really the correct thing? And a lot of what I do in hospital, outside of hospital, is basically the same principle. So trying to identify where people are getting something wrong, and then think about how do we fix it. And it's the fixing part that I'm particularly interested in. And it's kind of very nice that I think business school allow for that more applied approach that fits me very well.
Okay. What are we doing wrong and how can we get it right? Looking in the audience, I find someone who was a chief executive, is this not right, of Panda Express, who upon meeting you offered his restaurant to you to do an experiment.
Yes.
Okay.
So
restaurateurs do not typically do this. Okay.
So Tom came to my class one day, and after class he came, and I'll paraphrase, he said, "What do I do about orange chicken?" He said, "We have this orange chicken. It's not exactly health food. We have much better things that I would love for people to eat, but they love this orange chicken. What do we do about it?"
I always order it myself.
And of course, many people have these problems. But what was nice is, Tom, that he gave us a restaurant. He said, "Why don't you play out with this?" And it wasn't easy to get the people who were working there to agree to do it. But eventually, we got to play with it. So we tried different approaches. And the first approach we tried was the simple approach of let's give people more information. And if you know, in New York City, they've had this experiment for the last 2 years that they basically forced every fast food place to post calorie information on the menu. And what do you think happened when they posted all this information? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. There's a couple of papers show a slight decrease in consumption and some slightly increase in consumption, but on average, there's nothing. And why? Because you know what? It wasn't really a big mystery to go into a McDonald's and realize that this is not health food. And whether it's 1,500 calories or 1,400 calories or 1,350, this did not make a big difference. So we tried the same thing in Panda Express. We posted calorie information out there. Nothing happened. So Duke students, Duke employees work the same as the New Yorkers in that regard. But then we thought, okay, so information is not working. What could work? And we've done research before on procrastination. You've all been students. You all know procrastination. And procrastination is this issue that what's good for us in the long term and what's good for us in the short term are not necessarily the same things. Right? So just think for yourself for a second. How many people here have eaten more than you should have in the last week? Okay. How many people have exercised less than you should have in the last week? Okay.
All the same people.
You haven't raised your hand. No. How many people here have ever texted while driving? Had unprotected sex?
Not a single one.
So there's lots of problems like this of self-control, and orange chicken is one of those. So if you think about it, what are the mechanisms to try and overcome self-control? There's a couple of types of mechanisms. One of them is what's called Ulysses contracts. Right? And Ulysses contracts go back to Ulysses and the sirens. And the story is that Ulysses knew that when the sirens will come, he will be tempted. So he asked the sailors to tie himself to the mast and asked the sailors to put donag in their ears so that they would not tempt it. And there's kind of two approaches. He was tied up. He could listen to the song but not act on it. They couldn't even hear the song. But this is a kind of a self-control mechanism where you basically tie your own hands. We understand that something might not work well, and we're willing to sacrifice something ex ante to make sure that we will not fall to temptation. And I've done lots of experiments on procrastination using mechanisms like that. We also did something with the medical procedure. It turns out that in the history of the world, no men have ever woken up and said, "Today is a good day for colonoscopy." Some of you. So what do people do on the day when colonoscopy comes? They make up other stuff that they need to do. So we asked people, we said, when we schedule for people colonoscopy 3-4 months in advance, we said, would you give us a check for $500? And if you show up on time, you get your money back. And if you don't show up on time for whatever reason, you don't get your money back. Now, this is a bad offer, right? You can, at best, you can stay equal or you can lose money. But 50% of the people, more than 50% of the people, are willing to take this offer. Why? because we understand that in 3 months from now we will wake up and not feel like colonoscopy, and therefore we're willing to do something to tie our hands and force ourselves. So what did we do with orange chicken? In the first experiment, we basically asked people as they came in, we said, would you like to get half a portion of rice today, and by doing so decrease your calorie consumption by about 250 calories? And almost 50% of the people said they would be willing to do it. And then they got less food, they ate less, because it turns out people eat whatever is on their plate. It doesn't really matter how much they start with. And when we gave people a financial discount for doing the same thing, it didn't matter. It was the same proportion. So people were not doing it for money, they do it because they understood that if they get too much food, they will eat too much. What was kind of disturbing was that sometimes we looked at the people who took that offer the day before, and we didn't give them the offer the next day. And we said, would they ask by themselves? They said, hey, yesterday I got half a portion of rice. I would like to do it this again. Unprompted, nobody asked to do it on themselves. But the moment we asked them to, they were willing to do it. So ordering food is kind of an automated script that gets us to order too much food and get with too much food, and we end up eating it without thinking too much. And the question is, how do we stop that process? How do we intervene, and how can we offer people to actually think for a second and maybe act a little bit better? We have some other approaches now. We're trying to do some more experiments, but this was kind of the basic starting point. And I have to say, actually, I do want to say thank you, first of all. And we continuously look for companies who want to do experiments with us, right? We develop all these ideas and tests, and of course, most of our participants are Duke undergrads or random people on the web. But it's kind of very nice that companies want to do something with us and are willing to do the experiments the right way. And it's not easy, but it's great.
Well, the story you just told makes me want to ask a question, which is, if you can finally find the way to get someone to make a choice that's better for them rather than worse for them, how do you create a habit of that choice?
Yeah. So we're actually thinking about creating a term for it. So ordering in a restaurant is or in any place is a very interesting process, because people can actually observe what you're doing. It's not an individual process when you're online ordering something. There's actually a social component to it. The question is, if we take just one restaurant, and this one restaurant creates a term for simplifying things, it would only work in that restaurant. So one of the things we're asking is, can we create a term that is the opposite of supersize me, that basically would work across restaurants and will be part of people's script? So we're thinking right now about kind of what term we could use, can we get more restaurants to do it, and can we create a habit of doing that that is more general than just Panda
Are you
Express.
willing to share with us what the first draft of the term might be? That's the opposite of supersize me?
So the one that we have right now is right size. Right? So we're trying to do something that has an element of both correct and not too much, and whether this would actually catch up, we'll see.
Okay. So let me ask you, you've done a bunch of work that has to do with the idea of value and the value people attach to things. And one of the things I found interesting about it is the idea of the contextual nature of value. And then another of your experiments is you have, I think, shown that people's headaches don't go away when they use cheap aspirin, but when you pay more for it, they experience more benefit.
Yeah. So I'll say about those two things. So the first amazing thing is to think about money, and to think about how do we figure out how much something is worth. You know, we make decisions with money all the time, so we think we're experts, but if you stop and think about it for a second, what is the value of $2.50, and is a latte worth it or not? In fact, it's a very tough decision. Every time we decide to spend something on a cup of coffee, we're not going to be able to use that money for something else in the future. How do we think about all of those opportunities as a reflection of whether this is right or wrong? So it turns out that every time we face such a difficult decision, like whether a cup of coffee is worth $2.50, we don't do the right thing, we do the wrong thing. And there's lots of wrong things we could do with money, lots of wrong ways to think about it. And one of them is to think about money in relative terms rather than absolute terms. So think about food in restaurants. How much is it really worth? Well, we look at the range of what's being offered, and we take this into account. So I'll tell you just two things. We did one experiment that looked the following. We asked everybody in a big room to write down the last 2 digits of the Social Security number. So think about what your number is. You would write that down, and we will ask you to turn it into a dollar value. Mine is 79, I will write $79. And then I will show you a bunch of products, computer accessories, wines, chocolates, all kinds of things. And I said, would you pay that number, whatever the last two digits of the Social Security number, for this product? Would I pay $79 for each of those? Yes, no, you answer whatever you want. And then we do an auction. I say, hey, we're going to do an auction. How much would you pay for each of those things? What's the maximum you would be willing to pay? Everybody writes their bid. We find out the highest bid. They pay. They get the product. And then we look at the correlation between people's Social Security number and how much money they were willing to pay. And we find a correlation of about 0.5. People with high Social Security number give much higher number than people with low Social Security number. Now, it sounds incredibly strange, right? How do the people who give you Social Security number know that you will be a big spender or cheap? Of course, the reason is not because of Social Security number. It's because initial thoughts stick with us for too long. If you start thinking about a bottle of wine in the $79 range, you will keep on thinking about it in that range. And if you start at the low end of the range, you will keep on thinking about it. In some sense, our first decisions really carry out to our next decision. I'll give you one kind of product story about it. Think about the iPhone. If you remember when the iPhone came out, it was priced at $600. And then a few weeks later, they came back and said, sorry, it's only $400. Was this a good strategy or was this a bad strategy? Now, I got to speak to some people at Apple pricing, and in retrospect, they said it was a fantastic strategy. But imagine two worlds. Imagine a world in which the iPhone starts at $600, and then they say, sorry, only $400. And a world in which it starts at $400. And think about your task as a consumer. You sit there with this device that you can basically do this and this with it. Right? And now you have to decide how much are these things worth. Right? What a difficult decision. Is it a $50 range, a $200 range? How much is it worth? Really hard to tell. But in a world in which the iPhone started at $600, $400 look like a great deal. And in a world that it starts at $400, it's much less interesting. So it tells us again that the prices that people start thinking about something has a long-term implication, not just short-term implication, but actually long-term effect on what will happen. Now, in terms of the placebo, so we did this thing on pain medication, and we gave people electrical shocks to see how much pain they could take. And
that's the kind of thing we do at Duke.
So here is the interesting thing about placebo. What is so fascinating about placebo is that when a doctor comes to you and gives you an injection, even if the injection has nothing but IV fluid, you still get pain relief. Why? Because your brain secretes a substance that is very much like morphine. So think about it. Somebody injects you. Your thought that this is actually a pain reliever actually creates pain relief, physical pain relief in your body that we can track chemically. Now, it's kind of an interesting effect, but it all depends on your trust in that medication. What happens when your trust is lower? Well, when your trust is lower, your release of internal opioids basically get lower as well. So when you give people cheap medication, all of a sudden the effect goes down. And by the way, the same thing happens when the medication comes in an ugly brown box, or if the brand name doesn't remind you anything. So lots of those things basically work against the placebo. Placebo is a fantastic, amazing ability for the body to harness its own healing powers. And we kind of start to understand how it's working. Sadly, in much of modern medicine, we're working against it. Right? We're giving people, we don't tell them that medication is good. We're giving the medication, we tell them is generic. We're doing all these things to actually give people the feeling that they're not getting anything useful out of there.
Okay, well, now you've got me. I would just ask myself, so here we have this country trying to solve the mystery of healthcare finance. And one way you could do it is to make people realize that if you would use the medication that costs much less but is chemically interchangeable with something else, that would actually help with the finances. But you're going to say that actually that wouldn't totally work, right? Because the body imputes value to things that are more expensive?
Yeah, so I think the term generic is a very misfortunate term.
Okay. Because what does it mean?
When was the last time you got a compliment that says, Dick, this was a very generic lecture you just...
Yes, that's right. So let's go back. Okay, so what is the... Just as the correct opposite of supersize is right size, what is the extraordinarily attractive, what is the sizzling word for generic?
So actually, so not too long ago, I asked a group of advertising company that I did favors for in the past to come to New York for a day and do favors for me back. And I asked them to think exactly about that question, is what's a good term? And they came up with all kinds of suggestions, but one of the nice things was basic. And I kind of like that work, basic. They also said we need to add since, because generic medications have been on the market for much longer than some of the new ones. So to kind of add a symbol of how long the medication have been on the market. So we're now trying to do with another company, we're trying to do these words. Actually, there's a beautiful, can I say about another experiment we did with a drug company?
I'm just wondering whether I'm going to buy it because it's called basic.
It's not so much a question
How
of
about
whether you buy it.
elemental?
Elemental. You might be the only one who buy. So I'll tell you about another experiment we've done with a drug company recently. So this is a drug company that tries to convince people to move to generics. So imagine you go to your doctor and they subscribe to your branded medications, and then this company sends you a letter that says, please move to generics. You will save money, we will save money, your employer will save money, everybody would be happy. And what do you think people do when they get this letter? Nothing, right? So they basically, 1 year they tried to give people discount on generic that was basically they eliminated all co-pays. So people could save a lot of money, still basically nothing. And they came to talk to us and they said, look, people hate generics. We said, yes, there's a lot of reasons to hate generics, but you don't know if people are really hating generics or they're hating to do anything, right? Do they hate generics or do they hate to return this postcard or letter? And they try all kind of versions. It's a color letter, it's a black and white, it's postcard, it's this. But we say, we don't know, we can't just separate those two. Now, it looks like a very small step to sign something on a piece of postcard and send it back, but maybe it's too big. So we came up with an idea. We said, what if you wrote people a letter and you say, you have to return this letter? It's like a T intersection. There's no way for you to do nothing. You could decide generic, you could decide branded, but there's no way for you not to return it. If you don't return it, you're not getting your drugs anymore. And what happened now is that almost everybody returned the letter because nobody wanted, and 80% of the people switched to generics. Now here's the situation. How do you think about people's choices? It turns out that even small bumps in the road, like having to open an envelope and return something, turns out to be a big bump on the road in practical terms. Now, if you came to people and say, wouldn't you want to save $100 a year for returning a postcard? Everybody would say yes. But at the moment when it comes with the rest of the junk mail, people don't. But if you think very carefully about the specific process that people are going through, you can think about different interventions and you can think about how do we get people to actually behave better. And in healthcare, there's no better place to think about than healthcare, where the behaviors of the system, of the doctors, of the regulators, of the patients, it's all messed up in deep ways.
You've done work on the issue of incentives, and you've done an interesting group of work that shows that money works as an incentive up to a certain point, and then it doesn't work beyond a certain point, and then beyond a certain point, it actually is a bad incentive. How does that happen?
Yes. So this work gets me to be very unpopular in the banking world. So this work actually we copied from a very old work on rats. So over 100 years ago, there was this experiment on rats that basically said, imagine you had a cage, not imagine, they took a cage, and some of the areas of the cage had electrical shocks in them, and some were safe. And the rats had to figure out every day which areas of the cage were dangerous and which were safe. And there was like indication. One color was safe, one was dangerous. They switched the colors every day, and the rat had to learn. Now imagine, as the size of electrical shock grew, what grew in terms of the incentives of the rat? Every time the shock became stronger, the rat wanted to learn faster. When the shock was very small, who cared? When it was getting bigger, the rat wanted to learn faster. It was getting very big, the rat really wanted to learn fast. But what actually happened to learning ability? It went up to a level, and then it went down dramatically. Why? Because think about it. Imagine this hotel was like a maze and with electrical shocks, and you're running around and trying to figure out which areas of the hotel are safe and dangerous. And sometimes the shock was just so large, it will just take your breath away. And ask yourself whether under those conditions of fear, you'll be able to learn anything and remember anything, or whether you would be continuously stressed. So we were wondering whether the same thing happens with financial incentives. So we got 3 groups of people, and we gave them 6 tasks that require creativity and cognitive resources and memory and so on. And some people we said, if you do well on these tasks, we'll give you 1 day of salary, bonus. Another group we said, we'll give you 2 weeks of salary as a bonus. And a third group we said, we'll give you 5 months of salary as a bonus. And we ran this experiment in India when we couldn't pay people. And what happened? Performance was basically the same for the 1 day and 2 week bonus, and it went down dramatically for the 5 months bonus. And the point is that money is a two-edged sword. It's a motivator and it's a stressor. And up to a certain level, the motivational power are much more effective, but above a certain level, it gets worse, and the dangerous part of it are coming to play. And as you can imagine, whenever I go to give a talk to a bank, they don't like this result. And the banker said, oh, you know, we don't get stressed by anything. There's not enough money in the world that would stress us out. We're always on the improvement part. And of course, I invite them to come to the lab and let us test them, but nobody ever shows up. But what they do admit is that in October, November, and December, they think for hours about their bonuses. And who wouldn't? And they say that every day they open a new Excel spreadsheet and they try to figure out what their bonus is for this season. And again, who wouldn't if 80% of your salary, of your compensation, depended on bonuses? And I think it's one of those things we really have a blind eye to. And just consider the following. Imagine you're going for surgery. It's a very delicate surgery. And just before you close your eyes, you see the surgeon, and you can tell them that if they do well, you'll give them $100,000. And if they don't do well, you already hired an Italian hitman to wait for them outside of the hospital. Under those conditions, your surgeon will really, really, really want to do a good job, but will they be able to? Right? In fact, in many jobs, what we want people to do is to focus fully on the task. And money and other incentives are actually getting people to think about other things, not always the exact thing that we want.
Beside banks, a place where incentives are often talked about nowadays is in school teachers.
Yes.
And you know that there is a lot of parts of the country where the idea is that you could improve the quality of K through 12 education if you had the pay of teachers be more tightly correlated. There'd be an incentive to be a good teacher that would show up in the number of your students who did well. Yeah. Is that a good response to the underlying irrationality, or is that a bad response?
So most likely, again, not good. So what we know is that bonuses on the top side don't work as we expect, but also on the bottom side, they don't work as well. So imagine I asked you for a favor. I said, hey, would you help me change the tire on my car? Think to yourself, don't tell me, but think to yourself, what's the likelihood that you would do that? But imagine I added an incentive for this. I said, hey, would you help me change the tire on my car? I'll give you $3. What? What would happen now? Would you say to yourself, gee, I get to help Dan plus I get $3? No. Unlikely. Most likely you would say, oh, this is work. I don't work for $3. Give me $300, we can talk. Right? So what happens is that when we give people a small incentive, often we change something from being a social mission to work, and that amount can actually backfire. And it's not as if we give teacher a big enough incentives for it to really matter. We give it, it's about 10% of the salary, so it's not nothing, but it's actually not that big. And all of a sudden, we're telling teachers that they're not doing that for the social reason, for the calling of being a teacher. We're telling them they're trying to optimize 10%. So that's one bad thing. On top of that, kids are what's called the noisy signal in many ways. You think about the actual skill of a kid in school, what is it dependent on and how much control does the teacher actually have? Not that much. There's genetics, there's education, there's the parents, there's the neighborhood, there's nutritional. I mean, there's all kinds of things going on. How much control does the teacher actually have? So all of a sudden, you give people also incentives on something they don't have much control about, bless you, which is not very good. And you've seen all the news reports about how much teachers are cheating these days in education. I think part of it is just this helplessness, right? What else can they do to get this crazy measurement that they're supposed to reach? So they're resorting to teaching. So, by the way, compensation is incredibly interesting. And it's also amazing how little we know about it. I don't know of any company who has been willing to experiment with paying people for real. Like the most people do is sometimes they experiment with people in call centers, or Google has a different model and Zappos has a different model, and companies come up with different models, but very few companies are willing to actually take their employees, randomly assign them to two groups, see how you pay people differently. And of course, lawyers are part of it, and HRs, and there are rules against it. I understand all that, but at the same time, it's the most important part of business, and it's a part that we know very little about.
It's fascinating. So your books have two titles. One is called Predictably Irrational, and I find that interesting because it suggests that although irrationality is irrational, it's not like it's irrationally irrational, that it has its own patterns, that once you know to factor it in, you can actually factor it in rather predictable ways. Yeah. Okay, and then your second book is called The Upside of Irrationality, as if the very word irrationality suggests downside, like psychotics or something, except, and I guess the question I'm building up to is, what's the upside?
So I'll give you two stories on that. One is adaptation. So think about somebody like me. I was badly injured. I was in hospital for many years. If you asked me, when I got injured, I really didn't understand what was going on. But if you asked me a year later and you said how good life is going to be, I would have said life is going to be quite miserable forever. And for as long as I live, not forever. And life has improved. I've figured out how to live with my disability. I figured out what I can do, what I can't do. I found my place in life. And kind of there's been a trajectory of improvement after that. And this is kind of part of our ability to adapt, to figure out what we can do well, what we can't do well, how to figure it out. So that's a good thing. On the bad side, we make lots of other mistakes. So for example, you think to yourself, oh, if I only get a new car, I'll really be happy. And you are happy for a little bit, but then your happiness goes down afterward.
That's why you have to get another new one.
That's right. and renovate the kitchen, and But if you think about it,
if you haven't read Dan Ariely on the renovation of kitchens, I recommend that you do so right away.
It will save you lots of money. But if you think about it, it's the same kind of thing that gets us to adapt, that when we do something that makes us happy, it doesn't give us this happiness for a long time, and when something really bad happens, doesn't get us that misery for a long time. So it's really kind of a duality that has kind of pluses and negatives. And the second example to think about is to think about the fact that people are not inherently selfish. And this is kind of an interesting upside of irrationality. So think about human generosity. It's really quite astounding to think about how generous people are in nature. People are willing to give their time and their money and effort and all kinds of things to help other people. In the simple economic mindset, nobody should ever do something like that. So imagine the following game. Imagine that there are two people in the room, A and B. Actually, they're in a different room. They don't see each other. They'll never meet each other. And you give one person $10. And you say to that person, you can do two things with these $10. You can either go home, or you can send the money to the other person. If you send the money to the other person, the money will quadruple. It becomes $40. And that person then could do one of two things. They could either go home with $40, in which case you get zero, or they could send you back $20. What would people do? The economic model is saying, you would say, if I send the $10 to the other person, it becomes 40, that person will go home with all the money. They're anonymous. I'll never be able to find them. People don't give money to other people in the economic framework. But it turns out that's not what people do. People do send the $10, and people do send $20 back. It's not that we're generous all the time. It's not that we're generous without restriction. But it turns out that people are much more generous than the economic theory would have us believe. And for me, this is kind of incredibly, you know, I focus most of my time on the downsides, but from time to time, it's nice to remember the upside as well.
I've been having fun asking all the questions. Maybe we could take a couple of questions from you guys. Or I could ask some more. Here's one.
What happened to the orange chicken? So the experiment that we're having going on now is to see whether we can give people their joy of orange chicken without giving them a whole portion of it. So the question is, if somebody craves for orange chicken, can we satisfy by giving them 2 pieces of that and giving them the rest of something else? Would people opt for it? We don't have the data yet, but that's the direction we're going for. So orange chicken...
It's being renamed, the small portion is being renamed the joy of orange chicken.
So you know, we have to admit when we face obstacles that are a little too challenging, and getting people to not want orange chicken just doesn't seem human. But can we get them to do a little bit of it? We had one other design that ended up being very difficult. We wanted to break the store into 2 parts. That would be the fatty food on one side and the non-fatty food on the other. And then when people go and order, other people could see them, right? So it has 2 elements. One is if you go to the non-fat side of the restaurant, you don't tempt it. You don't see the orange chicken, right? But the other thing is you have a social signaling approach. This turned out to be very difficult with how it's designed, but we're still going to try out at some point to test it.
Please.
In this age of increasing consumerism, especially in the United States, where we've driven ourselves into a foreclosure situation and people maxing out on their credit cards, have you looked at what the incentives are and disincentives when you have folks who are not going to be able to stay in the homes that they've purchased, or people being forever in debt on credit cards? How as a society can we address both of those issues through a change in incentives built on addressing irrationality?
Okay, easy questions now. So
just make sure you write down the answer.
So a couple of things. So one of the sad things that have happened in the last 4 years is that the meaning of the word bankruptcy has changed. So there were always people that should have declared bankruptcy if they were perfectly economically rational and have not. Because they did not want the title. It felt like they were reneging on their promise. There was something important about it. And that has gone down dramatically. And now people who might actually be economically better not declaring it are declaring it. So we lost the battle on what does this word means. And I think that's a very sad thing. In terms of savings, the current generation who are my age, who have not saved, it's basically too late. There's no way, unless something really wonderful happened, like winning the lottery, it's not going to happen for many people that they will be able to save for retirement. So there's basically 2 approaches. One is teach people how to be nicer to their kids. That's but most importantly, I think that we need to shift the attention to the younger generation. So what happened is that the age in which people start saving is increasing dramatically. People are spending more money at younger age, and the question is how do we do it? And we have a program that we're trying to promote. We call this 401F. So you all know 401k. You save with your company. The idea for 401F is for kids to save with their friends and family. So imagine you're 15 and you're starting to save, and you send an email to your grandparents and your uncle and your aunts, and you say, how much would you match my saving rate? If I save for college, I save for my first car, and so on. And they each create some commitment, and you have a discussion about how you're going to save it. And basically kind of trying to build a system and seeing whether we can get the younger generation to get into the habit of saving early. What we're going to do with the current people who've basically lost lots of their retirement and then left the market in the worst in the worst time, I don't know how it would. I don't know how it would look like and what would happen. It's a very dire situation. I don't think we fully recognize how bad it's going to be.
I'm gonna, please.
Terrible.
Your courses being as popular as they are, what are you seeing in terms of, you know, science majors and humanity majors and music majors? What are you seeing in terms of what you're teaching them?
So last semester I taught a big undergrad class, and it was just restricted by the size of the classroom. If it was, we had lots of people on the wait list. If we had a bigger classroom, it would have been bigger. So it was 500 students. This semester I'm teaching a focus class. So I'm teaching 18 undergrads. It's a fun class. But also, you know, if I look at my lab, I have students are working with us from every possible department. Actually, 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, I taught a class that was joint listed in the English department. And it was joint listed in economics and the English department, and the students could do either run an experiment, or they could write a short story using principles from behavioral economics. And one of the students wrote a very nice story. She wrote a story about an Indian woman who had a restaurant, and her husband dies, and all of a sudden she realizes she needs to make more money. And her daughter, who is a consultant from LA, comes back to help her, and she uses every trick in the book to try and make her restaurant more expensive and for people to pay more money. She changed the size of the plates and what's on the menu, and she adds the word saffron in all kinds of places. She basically tries to use every trick in the book to try and make it happen. And the mother is kind of debating this and kind of not feel comfortable. Is this really her restaurant, and is this how she's going to treat her customers? And then she gets her first week of the restaurant operating this way. She sees how much money she makes, and she's okay with that. So the story could have ended elsewhere, but it was really nice to see how people from English were kind of thinking about how to deal with these topics and really exploring the moral side of it. So between, you know, teaching a very large undergrad class where people come from everywhere, basically, the focus class where most people are engineering students in my current focus class, the people who work in my lab that come from everywhere, and also kind of just the general amount of lectures and discussion around campus. I really see it as a very, I don't think I see the econ students more than I see the biology students. There's something very nice about the link between all the students around campus. I also have an appointment in the medical school, so I also see the medical students a lot there. Slightly different. They don't usually get involved, but we see them as well.
So I want to ask a question, and I'll use my authoritarian power to call on myself, and then we can go into dessert, which is, it's a pretty obvious question, which is, do you think irrationality is universal, or are different cultures irrational in different ways? I ask this question because if you think of this, consumer credit debt and credit cards in the United States, in China, the problem would be of over-saving, right, of under-consumption rather than over-consumption. And so how does this sort of cultural dimension factor into your work?
So I'll tell you about one experiment we're running cross-culturally. And I know you've heard this before. So we do lots of experiments on cheating. And our basic experiments on cheating look at the following. We give people a sheet of paper with 20 simple math problems, and we say you have 5 minutes, solve as many as you can, go. People solve as many as they can. At the end of the 5 minutes, we say stop, count how many questions you got correctly, go to the back of the room and shred this piece of paper. And then come back and tell us how many questions you solved correctly. Now people have a chance to cheat. What people don't know is that we played with a shredder. So the shredder only shred the sides of the page. But the main part of the page remains intact. We can find out how many questions they got. What happens? People solve 4 and report to be solving 6. Okay, so that's the basic story. Now, we ran this in many countries. And when we run this in other countries, we either run it at universities or we run it in bars. We kind of, and we run it in bars for 2 reasons. One is we want to get kind of the same type of people. And the second thing is we we use the price of beer as our universal currency. So for every 4 questions people ask correctly, they get 1 glass of beer. That's our way to do it. So I grew up in Israel, so the first country I went to test was Israel. So what do you think? Do the Israelis cheat more or less than the Americans? Actually, how many people think that the Israelis cheat more than the Americans? This is a relatively politically correct group. The Israelis cheat just the same. My Italian collaborator, Francesca, said, come to Italy, we'll show you what we can do. The Italians cheat just the same. We tried Turkey, we tried Canada, we tried the US, of course, England. We have a few other things. But so far, we haven't found a difference. And the question is why? And everybody who's traveled around feels that cheating is very different in different cultures. But here is how I understand it currently. I think that when we do our experiments, this particular experiment, it's without any cultural context. It's an abstract experiment in which people solve a problem and cheat from some unknown entity in a general way. And because of that, we tap kind of the basic human willingness to cheat a little bit and feel good about yourself. And that's kind of the same across cultures. But what happened is that culture operates on top of that. And some cultures take an activity, let's say infidelity, and say, like in France, saying this is not a question of morality, right? They're just taking this out of the moral consideration. Some countries are taking something like cheating on your taxes and saying more is tolerable. So I think the basic understanding of kind of human nature is similar, but then culture operates on top of that and can change our tolerance for specific activities. So it's not about our basic skill. It's about the general thing. And the same things go for savings. You know, think about the Japanese society. The Japanese save much more than Americans. And at the same time, after the last tragedy, if you looked at how the Japanese were standing in line and waiting, it was just incredible to see how much self-control people have. Do the Japanese have more self-control than Americans? Well, if you've ever been to a bar in Japan, you wouldn't think so, right? But I think that there are specific activities where the social construct is so powerful that it's overriding the particular human tendency. So I think we're all basically the same, but culture is important on top of that. We just have to figure out the different ways.
That's a great answer. Well, what if we adjourn to a local bar where you can run tests on us and we can ask you questions one-on-one? So thanks, Dan. You were fantastic.
Thank you.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.